In the stone chambers beneath medieval castles, in the courtyards of churches, in public squares where crowds gathered to watch, human beings inflicted unimaginable suffering on other human beings. For 1,000 years, torture wasn't hidden or shameful. It was public, legal, systematic. It had rules, procedures, specialists who knew exactly how much pain a body could endure before it broke. The devices they created, the methods they refined, the justifications they offered, all of it was documented, preserved, normalized. Before we descend into these dark centuries, settle in. Let time fall away. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it there right now? I always wonder how far these stories travel, how many time zones they cross. The medieval period stretched roughly from the 5th century to the 15th, though torture existed long before and continued long after. But these 1,000 years represent torture's systematic development, its legal codification, its integration into religious and secular justice systems. This wasn't primitive barbarity. It was organized, rationalized, defended by theology and law. We often imagine medieval torture as random cruelty, sadistic lords tormenting peasants in dungeons. The reality was far more structured. Torture served specific purposes within legal systems. It extracted confessions. It punished crimes. It demonstrated authority. It maintained social order. Different methods were prescribed for different situations, different crimes, different social classes. The person who designed and operated these systems wasn't a monster acting on impulse. They were officials following procedures, technicians applying their craft, believers doing what they thought necessary and right. The rack might be the most famous torture device. It appears in countless historical accounts featured in Shakespeare's plays, became shorthand for medieval justice. The mechanism was simple, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's ankles were fastened to one roller, wrists to the other. Then the rollers turned, stretching the body. Slowly. The torturer controlled the speed, the intensity, the duration. What made the rack effective wasn't just pain. It was the anticipation. The victim watched the preparations, saw the device, understood what was coming. Often, this was enough. Many confessed before being stretched at all. For those who didn't, the experience was methodical. The first turns produced discomfort, then pain, then agony as joints strained. Eventually, with enough tension, joints dislocated, shoulders first, usually, then hips, then elbows and knees. The sounds of popping joints, the screams, the pleas, all served the rack's purpose. But the rack also left the victim alive and able to speak. That was crucial. Dead people couldn't confess. Bodies damaged beyond recovery couldn't provide testimony. The torturer's skill lay in calibrating pain, in knowing how far to go, when to stop, when to resume. It was a craft requiring knowledge of human anatomy, understanding of pain thresholds, attention to the victim's responses. England used the rack extensively, particularly in the Tower of London. The device there was called the Duke of Exeter's daughter, named after the Duke of Exeter who introduced it to England in 1447. Religious dissenters, accused traitors, suspected conspirators, all faced the rack. Guy Fawkes, caught in the gunpowder plot of 1605, was racked in the Tower. His signature on his confession, before and after torture, shows the physical damage. The first signature is clear and legible. The second, after the rack, is barely recognisable scrawl. The rack's use wasn't arbitrary. English common law actually prohibited torture, a fact that seems contradictory given the Tower of London's reputation. But the rack operated in a legal grey area. It required royal approval, a warrant from the monarch or Privy Council. This made torture exceptional, requiring special authorization rather than being routine. In practice, this meant torture was reserved for cases involving threats to the crown, treason, heresy, sedition. France developed its own version called the estrapode. The victim's hands were bound behind their back, attached to a rope running through a pulley on the ceiling. The torturer hoisted them up, suspending them by their arms twisted behind them. The shoulder joints bore the entire body weight in an unnatural position. Pain was immediate and intense. Sometimes weights were attached to the victim's feet, increasing the strain. Sometimes the torturer would release the rope suddenly, dropping the victim part way before catching them. the jolt causing additional damage to already strained joints. Water torture took many forms across medieval Europe. The most common involved forcing water into the victim's mouth and nose. They would be bound to a table, head tilted back, mouth forced open. Water poured continuously. The victim had to swallow or drown. Their stomach filled with water distending painfully. They couldn't breathe properly. The sensation of drowning came in waves between swallowing. This continued until confession, or until the torturer decided to stop. The Spanish Inquisition developed water torture into a science. They used a toca, a cloth placed over the victim's face. Water poured onto the cloth triggered the sensation of drowning even more intensely than water directly in the mouth. The victim couldn't see, couldn't breathe, felt water everywhere. Their body's panic response activated fully. They thrashed against restraints, desperate for air. The interrogators asked questions between pourings, offering to stop if the victim confessed. Modern waterboarding is essentially the same technique. When the United States debated whether waterboarding constituted torture in the early 21st century, medieval history provided clear precedent. The Spanish Inquisition considered it torture. So did the international community prosecuting Japanese soldiers for war crimes after World War II. The technique survived because it's effective. It creates the overwhelming panic of drowning without actually drowning the victim, can be repeated many times, leaves no visible marks. But we're still in the realm of techniques designed to extract confession. Medieval torture also served another purpose: punishment. Once guilt was established, often through torture itself, punishment needed to be administered, and medieval punishment was public, spectacular, designed to horrify and deter. Breaking on the wheel represented one of the most dreaded punishments. The wheel was a large wooden wagon wheel mounted horizontally. The condemned person was tied to it, limbs stretched along the spokes. Then an executioner used an iron bar to break the victim's bones, systematically working through limbs. 2 blows to each shin, 2 to each thigh, 2 to each forearm, 2 to each upper arm. The chest and stomach came last. Each blow shattered bone. The victim remained conscious through much of this, screaming, begging, sometimes praying. After the breaking, the wheel would be raised on a pole and left in a public place. The victim, bones shattered but still alive, would remain bound to the wheel, exposed to the elements, suffering from their injuries. Death could take hours or days. Carrion birds might come while they still lived. The display served multiple purposes. The criminal suffered terribly, satisfying both revenge and abstract justice. The spectacle warned others. The slow death emphasized the severity of the crime. The wheel was used across Europe but was particularly associated with Germanic territories. Each region had variations. Some executioners killed the victim with a final blow to the chest or neck before mounting the wheel, a mercy killing that ended suffering. Others left the victim to die slowly. Some broke the spine last. Others broke it early. The executioner's technique mattered. A skilled executioner broke bones cleanly, ensuring maximum pain while keeping the victim alive. A clumsy executioner might kill too quickly, or leave the victim to suffer even longer than intended. The crimes that warranted breaking on the wheel were typically the most serious. Murder, particularly with aggravating factors like poisoning or killing family members. Highway robbery, arson. In some jurisdictions, counterfeiting. The punishment was specifically designed to exceed the crime in severity, to make the criminal's suffering so great that the scales of justice tipped back toward balance. St. Catherine of Alexandria was supposedly martyred on a breaking wheel in the 4th century, though the historical accuracy is questionable. According to legend, when they tried to break her on the wheel, it miraculously broke instead, so they beheaded her. The Catherine wheel became an iconic symbol, appearing in art and architecture. The irony that a torture device became a saint's symbol, that churches celebrated and commemorated an instrument of suffering, reflects medieval culture's complicated relationship with pain and death. Burning alive was reserved primarily for heresy, though it was also used for some other crimes like witchcraft and certain forms of treason. The logic was theological. Heresy was a crime against God, not just against humans or the state. The heretic's body needed to be destroyed completely, reduced to ash, preventing proper Christian burial. Fire also had symbolic significance. It anticipated the eternal flames awaiting the heretic's soul. The procedure varied. Sometimes the victim was chained to a stake with wood piled around them. The fire would be lit and would burn slowly, consuming the victim over many minutes. Sometimes they were placed in a barrel or cage to prevent escape. Sometimes executioners showed mercy by strangling the victim before the fire consumed them, or by hanging a bag of gunpowder around their neck that would explode and kill them quickly once the flames reached it. But often there was no mercy. The fire burned hot enough to char flesh, but not hot enough to kill quickly. The victim would scream until the smoke and heat damaged their lungs. Their clothes would ignite first, then their hair. Fat would melt and burn. The smell of burning human flesh, witnesses report, is distinctive and nauseating. Crowds would gather to watch. Some cheered, some prayed. Some looked away but felt compelled to witness the punishment of heresy. Jan Hus, the Czech reformer we discussed earlier in the Vatican context, burned at the stake in 1415. He sang hymns until the smoke choked off his voice. Joan of Arc burned in 1431, convicted of heresy by a church court working with the English. She was 19 years old. The executioner was reportedly disturbed afterward, believing he had burned a saint. Giordano Bruno burned in 1600 in Rome's Campo de Fiori for heretical beliefs. Witnesses said he was tied to a stake and burned alive, refusing to recant even as the flames rose. The number of people burned for heresy during the medieval period is difficult to calculate precisely. Thousands, certainly, possibly tens of thousands. The Spanish Inquisition alone executed around 5,000 people over several centuries, many by burning. The German witch hunts of the late medieval and early modern period killed tens of thousands more. Each death followed legal procedures, had official authorization, was documented in court records. The Spanish Inquisition deserves particular attention because it's often misunderstood. Modern research has challenged the image of the Inquisition as a reign of unchecked terror. The reality was both better and worse than the legend. Better in that the Inquisition actually executed fewer people than secular courts of the period, followed more rigorous legal procedures than many assume, and prohibited some of the worst tortures used elsewhere. Worse in that it was systematic, bureaucratic, relentless, and operated for centuries. The Inquisition's procedure was methodical. An accusation would trigger an investigation. The accused would be arrested and questioned. If they confessed and showed contrition, they might receive relatively mild punishment. Fines, pilgrimages, wearing penitential garb. If they denied guilt or refused to cooperate, torture could be authorized to extract confession. But Inquisition rules limited torture's duration and severity, required medical oversight, prohibited permanent injury. This sounds almost reasonable until you remember what it meant in practice. The estrapedo that we discussed earlier was an approved Inquisition technique. So was the toca water torture. So was the rack, though used less frequently. The Inquisition kept detailed records of interrogations, including descriptions of torture sessions. These documents are chilling in their bureaucratic precision. They note how many turns of the rack, how long water was applied, whether the accused confessed, what they confessed to. The Inquisition also pioneered psychological torture techniques. Suspects might be kept in cells for months, interrogated repeatedly, shown the torture chamber and devices without being tortured. The anticipation, the isolation, the constant pressure often produced confessions without physical torture. When torture was applied, it was often brief but intense, calibrated to break the suspect's will without causing permanent damage that would interfere with later public punishment. One particularly cruel practice was the auto da fe, a public ceremony where Inquisition sentences were announced and carried out. These events were elaborate spectacles, sometimes lasting all day. The condemned would be dressed in penitential garments, paraded through streets, forced to hear sermons about their sins. Those receiving lesser sentences would be humiliated but released. Those condemned to death would be handed over to secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. The Inquisition's defenders argue it was less arbitrary than secular justice, that its procedures protected the accused in some ways, that its execution rate was relatively low. These arguments are technically accurate but morally hollow. The Inquisition still tortured people for their beliefs, still burned people alive, still destroyed families and communities, still spread terror throughout Spain and beyond. That it followed rules while doing so makes it more disturbing, not less. Let's turn to devices that existed more in imagination than reality, but which reveal medieval attitudes toward torture. The Iron Maiden is the most famous example. According to legend, it was a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with spikes. The victim would be placed inside and the door closed, driving spikes through their body. Death would be slow and agonizing. The problem is that Iron Maidens probably didn't exist in medieval times. The examples in museums were constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries for display purposes. No reliable medieval source describes them. No archaeological evidence supports their use. They appear to be Victorian-era creations, built to satisfy tourists' expectations of medieval barbarity. Yet the Iron Maiden endures in popular imagination precisely because it seems so perfectly medieval. It combines craftsmanship with cruelty, religious imagery with torture, spectacle with suffering. It tells us less about medieval reality than about later eras' need to imagine the medieval period as uniquely barbaric, to place horror safely in the past and congratulate ourselves on being more civilized. Other legendary devices fall into this category. The Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat where the victim would be lowered onto the point. The pair of anguish, an expandable device inserted into body cavities and gradually opened. These probably existed in some form but were likely rare, possibly unique to specific locations, nowhere near as common as their presence in torture museums suggests. The distinction between historical reality and later embellishment matters. Medieval torture was horrific enough without invented additions. When we add fictional devices and exaggerated stories, we actually diminish the real historical horror. We make medieval torture into entertainment, into a horror movie, rather than confronting it as systematic violence that humans inflicted on humans for centuries under legal sanction. So what was real? What can we document? Branding was certainly real. Criminals were marked with hot irons, burning symbols into their skin. Thieves might be branded on the hand or forehead with a T. Forgerers might receive an F. The brand marked them permanently, ensuring they couldn't escape their criminal past. It was painful, created infected wounds, left permanent scars, but it was also practical from the authorities' perspective. The marked criminal was instantly recognizable. Mutilation served similar purposes. Thieves might have a hand cut off. Liars might have their tongue removed or split. False witnesses might be blinded. These punishments were permanent, visible, proportional in a grim symbolic way. The hand that stole couldn't steal again. The tongue that lied couldn't speak falsehoods. The eyes that witnessed falsely couldn't mislead others. Amputation as punishment required skill to execute properly. Cut too high on the limb and the criminal might bleed out. Cutting completely and they'd suffer infection. Executioners who specialised in mutilation knew exactly where to cut, how to cauterise the wound, how to ensure the criminal survived to bear their mark. These weren't spontaneous acts of rage. They were calculated punishments carried out by professionals. The pillory and stocks were everywhere in medieval towns. These restraint devices held criminals in public places where they couldn't escape, but could be subjected to community punishment. Someone in the pillory would have their head and hands locked in place. Someone in the stocks would have their feet secured. They'd remain there for hours or days, unable to move, exposed to weather, unable to eat or drink or relieve themselves unless someone helped them. But the restraint was only part of the punishment. The public nature was crucial. People passing by would mock the criminal, throw things at them, sometimes assault them. Rotten food was common. Stones were thrown. Human waste was thrown. The community participated in the punishment, expressing their outrage and enforcing social norms. Sometimes these attacks became severe enough to cause serious injury or even death. The authorities generally tolerated this community participation in punishment. It cost them nothing and served their purposes. The humiliation reinforced social hierarchies. The physical abuse deterred crime. The community involvement made everyone complicit in the justice system, preventing sympathy for criminals. A person who threw stones at someone in the pillory had invested themselves in that person's guilt and punishment. Scolds' bridles or branks were metal cages fitted over women's heads, usually with a metal plate or spike that pressed into the mouth, preventing speech. These devices were used to punish women considered gossipy, quarrelsome, or insufficiently submissive. The gendered nature of this punishment was explicit. Men might be punished for disruptive speech with fines or the pillory, but the scold's bridle was specifically for women who violated gender norms by speaking too freely. Women would be forced to wear these devices in public, paraded through streets, confined to the pillory while wearing them. The humiliation was intense. They were displayed as examples of inappropriate female behaviour, objects of mockery and scorn. The physical discomfort of the metal cage, the pain from the mouthplate, the inability to speak or eat, all reinforced the message: women should be silent, submissive, controlled. The persistence of scolds' bridles into the 17th and even 18th centuries, well past the medieval period proper, reflects how gender-based punishment outlasted other medieval practices. Torture of criminals became less acceptable, but controlling women's speech remained culturally sanctioned longer. Ducking stools operated similarly. A woman accused of being a scold would be strapped to a chair attached to a lever or crane. The chair would be dunked repeatedly into water, a pond or river. She'd be submerged, pulled up, questioned, dunked again. This continued until she promised to behave properly. Like the scold's bridle, ducking stools specifically targeted women for verbal offences that men would not be punished for. The ducking stool was also used in witch trials, based on the logic that witches would float while innocent women would sink. This created a no-win situation. Sink and you might drown, float and you'd be executed as a witch. Some women pulled from the water after sinking had drowned or nearly drowned. The supposed test was really just another form of torture and execution, hidden behind the pretense of divine judgment. Witch trials occupy a complicated place in our discussion, because the height of witch persecution actually came after the medieval period, in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the groundwork was laid in medieval thinking about demons, about women's weakness, about the reality of malevolent supernatural power. Medieval theology and law created the framework that later generations used to justify killing tens of thousands of people, mostly women, accused of witchcraft. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, right at the end of the medieval period, became the handbook for witch hunters. Written by 2 Dominican friars, it explained how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to extract confessions, how to execute them. The book was deeply misogynistic, arguing that women were more susceptible to demonic influence because of their weaker intellects and stronger lusts. It described torture procedures in detail and insisted that witches must be made to confess before execution. Witch trials followed predictable patterns. An accusation would be made, often by someone with a grudge against the accused. The accused would be arrested and interrogated. If they didn't confess, torture would be applied. Under torture, most people confessed eventually. But the confession had to include specific details. What demons did you worship? When did you attend the witch's Sabbath? Who else was there? These forced confessions then implicated others, creating chains of accusations. The logic was circular and inescapable. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you refused to confess, that proved the devil was strengthening you, also evidence of guilt. Torture continued until confession was extracted. Once you confessed, you were executed. The only variable was how long you held out and how much you suffered before confessing. Some accused witches tried to outsmart the system by confessing immediately, hoping for a quick death. But interrogators wanted names of other witches. They'd torture until the accused provided names, then arrest those people and repeat the process. In some German territories, this led to witch panics, where dozens or hundreds of people were accused, tortured, and killed in cascading waves of accusations. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg, Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg, oversaw the execution of some 900 people for witchcraft between 1623 and 1631. The Prince Archbishop of Cologne, Ferdinand of Bavaria, presided over similar purges. These were church officials, educated men, believers in reason and law, yet they authorized mass killings based on tortured confessions of attending Sabbaths with demons and causing crop failures through magic. Children were not exempt. Some accused witches, under torture, named their own children as accomplices. Children as young as 7 or 8 were tried, tortured, and executed for witchcraft. In Würzburg, dozens of children died. The youngest victims were sometimes burned at the stake holding dolls, still children even as they were treated as servants of Satan. The witch trials represent torture at its most systemically destructive. It wasn't punishment for actual crimes. It was persecution based on impossible accusations, sustained by torture that forced false confessions, justified by theology that made questioning it dangerous. The trials destroyed communities, killed innocents, and traumatized generations. Let's return to more conventional criminal justice and examine judicial torture more carefully. Throughout medieval Europe, confession was considered the queen of proofs. In many jurisdictions, conviction required either eyewitness testimony from multiple credible witnesses or a confession. For serious crimes, eyewitnesses were often unavailable. This made confession crucial for prosecution. But how do you obtain confession from someone guilty who refuses to admit it? Medieval legal theorists solved this problem by authorizing torture. If sufficient circumstantial evidence suggested guilt, torture could be applied to extract confession. The resulting confession, if properly obtained according to legal procedures, could support conviction. This system had internal logic. It prevented conviction based solely on suspicion or uncorroborated accusation. It required evidence before torture was authorized. It recognized that people might lie under torture, so rules attempted to ensure confessions were genuine. But it also created perverse incentives and terrible outcomes. Innocent people would confess under torture to make it stop. Guilty people who could withstand torture might go free while weaker innocent people were convicted. The requirement for confession meant torture was applied even when everyone knew the person was guilty, just to satisfy legal formalities. And determining what constituted sufficient evidence to authorize torture was subjective, allowing prejudice and corruption to influence who got tortured. Different jurisdictions had different rules about torture. Some required judicial oversight, with a judge present during torture. Some allowed torture only for specific crimes. Some limited the duration or methods. Some required that confessions be confirmed after torture, with the accused repeating their confession voluntarily once the torture ended. That last requirement particularly reveals the system's contradictions. The accused would be tortured until they confessed. Then they'd be removed from the torture chamber and asked to confirm their confession. If they recanted, claiming they only confessed because of torture, they'd be tortured again. This cycle could repeat multiple times. Eventually, most people confirmed their confessions just to avoid more torture, even though those confirmations were no more voluntary than the original tortured confessions. France maintained detailed records of judicial torture. The question ordinary and question extraordinary refer to different intensities of torture. The ordinary question might involve the rack or strappado applied moderately. The extraordinary question meant more intense or prolonged torture. A person might survive the ordinary question without confessing, then break under the extraordinary question. French courts tortured accused criminals, but also tortured convicted criminals before execution, particularly in cases of murder or treason. This torture didn't aim to extract information. It was preparatory torture, a preliminary punishment before the main execution. The logic was that someone guilty of a terrible crime deserved to suffer terribly. The execution alone wasn't sufficient. They needed to be tortured first, increasing their total suffering to match the severity of their crime. This reveals a fundamentally different understanding of justice than modern systems claim to embrace. Medieval justice wasn't primarily about rehabilitation, deterrence, or even protecting society. It was about balancing scales, about making the criminal suffer proportionally to the harm they caused. This retributive model justified torture as a component of punishment itself, separate from its use in extracting confession. The public nature of executions served multiple functions. It demonstrated the state's power to punish. It provided entertainment, a spectacle that drew crowds. It offered moral instruction, showing the consequences of crime. It allowed the community to participate in justice through their presence and reactions. Execution days were events. Crowds gathered early to get good viewing positions. Vendors sold food and drink. People brought children, treating it as a family outing. The condemned person would be transported to the execution site, sometimes in a cart, sometimes forced to walk. They might be dressed in special clothes, might carry signs declaring their crime, might have a priest accompanying them offering final spiritual consolation. The execution itself varied by crime and jurisdiction. Beheading was considered a merciful, honourable death, reserved for nobility or for those who could afford to bribe the executioner. A skilled executioner could behead someone with a single clean stroke. The condemned person would kneel, place their head on a block, and the axe or sword would fall. Death was nearly instantaneous if done properly. Hanging was more common for ordinary criminals. The condemned person would have a noose placed around their neck and be pushed off a ladder or platform. Sometimes death came quickly from a broken neck. Often it came slowly from strangulation, the person kicking and struggling as they suffocated. This could take many minutes. Some executioners or family members would pull on the condemned person's legs to hasten death, a grim mercy. Drawing and quartering was the most severe English execution, reserved for treason. The condemned person would be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still alive. Their genitals would be cut off and burned before their eyes. Their abdomen would be opened and their intestines pulled out and burned. Only then would they be beheaded. Finally, their body would be cut into quarters and the pieces displayed in different locations as a warning. This punishment was carried out publicly. Crowds watched the entire process. The prolonged suffering, the deliberate mutilation, the symbolic destruction of the traitor's body all served to demonstrate that treason was the ultimate crime deserving the ultimate punishment. The last person to be hanged, drawn and quartered in England was in 1820, well after the medieval period, but showing how these practices persisted. The executioner was a specialised professional. They might also work as the town's torturer, the person who operated the rack or applied the strappado. They were often paid per execution or torture session, making it a profession like any other. Some executioner positions were hereditary, passed from father to son. The job came with social stigma, being associated with death and violence, but also with a certain dark prestige and guaranteed income. A skilled executioner was valued. They could behead cleanly, hang efficiently, torture effectively. They knew anatomy, understood pain, could calibrate their techniques to the required outcome. They maintained their tools, kept their axes sharp, their ropes strong, their torture devices in working order. They were, in a grim sense, craftsmen. Some executioners became famous or notorious. Charles-Henri Sanson served as royal executioner in France and executioner of Paris for decades, spanning the Revolution. He executed Louis XVI and thousands during the Terror. His family held the position of executioner for 7 generations. Giovanni Battista Bugatti served as executioner for the Papal States in the 19th century, executing 516 people over a 68-year career. These men kept records, passed on techniques, professionalized death. The executioner's social position was contradictory. They performed necessary state functions, yet they were considered unclean, tainted by their work. They might be well paid but socially isolated. People needed their services but avoided associating with them. In some places, executioners were required to live outside town walls or wear identifying clothing. Their children struggled to marry because of the family profession stigma. Yet executioners also had unusual privileges. They might be allowed to keep the belongings of executed criminals. They might sell pieces of the rope used in hangings, considered to have magical properties. They might sell corpse fat or other body parts for use in folk medicine. These macabre perquisites supplemented their income and gave them economic power despite social stigma. The connection between torture, execution and medicine was closer than we might expect. Anatomists studied executed criminals' bodies, learning about human anatomy from dissection. Executioners sold body parts to physicians and apothecaries. The boundary between healing and harming, between medical knowledge and violent death, was permeable in ways that disturb modern sensibilities. Torture also connected to religious practice in unsettling ways. Christian theology emphasized suffering as purification, as a path to redemption. Christ suffered on the cross to redeem humanity. Martyrs suffered to prove their faith. Ordinary believers were called to take up their cross, to endure suffering in this life for reward in the next. This theological framework made torture comprehensible, even acceptable. If suffering purified the soul, then forcing criminals to suffer might save them. If pain brought one closer to God, then torture might paradoxically be a gift to the tortured. This logic appears in Inquisition records, where torturers claimed they acted from charity, trying to save heretics' souls by making them confess and repent before death. The penitential system contributed to this thinking. Medieval Christians confessed sins to priests, who assigned penance proportional to the sin's severity. Penance might involve prayer, fasting, pilgrimage, or physical mortification like flagellation. The idea was that suffering in this life reduced punishment in purgatory. Self-inflicted pain had spiritual value. Flagellants took this to extremes, whipping themselves publicly as penance for their sins and the sins of the world. During plagues and crises, groups of flagellants would travel from town to town, performing ritualized self-torture to appease God's wrath. This practice horrified church authorities, who tried to suppress it, but it reveals how deeply embedded the connection between pain and piety was in medieval culture. Given this religious context, torture for heresy made terrible sense. Heretics endangered not just themselves, but the entire Christian community. Their false beliefs could damn souls, could bring divine punishment on everyone. Forcing them to recant through torture could save them from eternal damnation. The temporary pain of earthly torture was nothing compared to eternal hellfire. Therefore torture was merciful. This logic seems monstrous to us. But understanding it historically requires recognizing that medieval people genuinely believed in hell, in demons, in the devil's power to deceive and damn. They believed heresy was more dangerous than murder because it killed souls, not just bodies. Within that worldview, torture to force recantation was rational, even compassionate. The decline of torture came gradually and unevenly. The Enlightenment brought new thinking about justice, punishment, and human dignity. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued against torture in his 1764 book on crimes and punishments. He pointed out that torture was unreliable, that innocent people confessed to stop pain, while guilty people might have high pain tolerance. He argued that punishment should be certain and proportional, not arbitrary and cruel. These ideas gained traction slowly. Some jurisdictions abolished judicial torture in the late 18th century. Others maintained it into the 19th. Prussia abolished torture in 1754, one of the first. France waited until 1788. England never formally abolished torture because it was never formally legal, existing in grey areas and through royal prerogative. But abolishing torture legally didn't end it. Illegal torture continued, hidden in police stations and prisons rather than performed publicly. Colonial powers used torture in their colonies long after abolishing it at home. Military forces tortured enemy combatants and civilians. Political police tortured dissidents. Torture went underground but didn't disappear. The 20th century saw torture's resurgence under totalitarian regimes. The Gestapo tortured prisoners. The Soviet NKVD tortured prisoners. Chinese communists tortured prisoners. Latin American dictatorships tortured prisoners. Torture became systematic again, no longer publicly justified but widely practiced. The techniques evolved, becoming psychological as well as physical, but the essential practice remained. Even democracies practiced torture, though often denying it. French forces tortured Algerian prisoners during the War for Independence. British forces tortured Irish prisoners during the Troubles. American forces tortured prisoners during the War on Terror, calling it enhanced interrogation to avoid the legal prohibitions against torture. This history reveals an uncomfortable truth. Torture's medieval decline wasn't a steady march toward enlightenment and human rights. It was a change in how torture was understood and discussed more than a change in practice. Medieval torture was legal, public, justified. Modern torture is illegal, hidden, denied. But both medieval torturers and modern ones claim necessity, claim their victims deserve it, claim it serves justice or security. We need to return to specific medieval practices we haven't fully explored. The ordeal was an early medieval practice that blended torture with divine judgment. The accused person would undergo a painful test, holding hot iron, plunging their hand into boiling water, being bound and thrown into water, walking on hot coals, eating consecrated bread that was believed to choke the guilty. The logic was that God would protect the innocent and allow the guilty to suffer. If your hand holding hot iron didn't burn, or if burns healed quickly, you were innocent. If you sank when thrown into water, you were innocent because water, being pure, would accept the innocent and reject the guilty. If you floated, you were guilty because water rejected you. The Church officially supported ordeals until 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council prohibited clerical participation. This ended most ordeals because they required priests to bless the water or iron, to consecrate the bread, to sanctify the process. Without clerical involvement, the ordeal lost its claim to divine authority. Why did the Church end its support for ordeals? Partly because growing legal sophistication made ordeals seem primitive and unreliable. Partly because the ordeal's logic was questionable. Why would God consistently reveal guilt through physical tests? Partly because ending ordeals increased judicial torture's importance, and courts preferred torture because it gave judges more control over outcomes. The replacement of ordeals with torture represented a shift from supernatural to naturalistic thinking about justice. Ordeals depended on divine intervention to reveal truth. Torture depended on human technique and pain's psychological power. This was in some ways a modernizing development, judges taking control of justice from God. But it was hardly progress for those subjected to torture instead of ordeals. Trial by combat was another form of ordeal that persisted longer. Two parties in a legal dispute would fight, and the victor was deemed to be in the right because God favoured their cause. This sounds absurd until you remember that medieval people genuinely believed God intervened in worldly affairs. If God controlled everything, then combat outcomes revealed divine will. Trial by combat was available primarily to nobles and those who could afford to hire champions to fight for them. A peasant accused of theft couldn't challenge their accuser to combat. A knight accused of treason could. This meant trial by combat reinforced social hierarchies while claiming to reveal God's judgment. Women, the elderly, clergy, and others unable to fight could hire champions. This created a profession of judicial fighters, men who would fight on behalf of others for payment. A skilled fighter could make a living as a champion. But this also meant justice depended partly on who could afford the better fighter, which seems to contradict the claim that God decided outcomes. Trial by combat persisted in some places until astonishingly late. The last recorded judicial combat in France occurred in 1547. England didn't abolish it until 1819, after someone demanded trial by combat, and the court had to acknowledge the right still technically existed. These late survivals were anomalies, but they show how legal traditions persisted long after their underlying logic was abandoned. Let's examine torture in specific contexts. Piracy provides an interesting case. Pirates captured at sea faced particularly harsh treatment. They were outside normal legal protections, enemies of all nations, subject to summary execution. When pirates were captured and brought to trial, torture was frequently used to extract information about their activities, their accomplices, their hidden treasure. The idea of torture to find treasure wasn't just greed. Pirates often buried or hid their loot. Recovering stolen property served justice by returning it to rightful owners, or, more realistically, claiming it for the crown. But torture for treasure did attract accusations that authorities were more interested in enrichment than justice. Pirates also faced theatrical executions designed to be especially memorable. The Admiralty would execute pirates at low tide on the Thames, then leave their bodies hanging in gibbets until 3 tides had washed over them. Other executed pirates were tarred and hung in cages at harbour entrances, warnings to sailors considering piracy. The bodies would remain for months or years, rotting slowly, becoming skeletons, finally falling apart. Captain Kidd, the famous pirate, was hanged in London in 1701. His body was tarred and hung in a gibbet at Tilbury Point, where it remained for years as a warning. The gibbet cage was designed to fit the body's rough shape, holding it together as it decomposed. This macabre practice, called gibbeting, continued into the 19th century in England. Smuggling faced similar harsh treatment. Customs officials had legal authority to torture suspected smugglers, particularly to find hidden goods. Smuggling was considered a serious crime because it deprived the Crown of revenue. In coastal areas where smuggling was endemic, authorities used torture and exemplary executions to try to control the practice. Religious minorities faced systematic torture across medieval Europe. Jews were frequent targets, accused of various crimes and tortured to extract confessions. The blood libel accusations we discussed earlier often led to arrest and torture of Jewish community members. They'd be tortured until they confessed to murdering Christian children for ritual purposes, confessions that were obviously false but which justified further persecution. During the Spanish Inquisition's early decades, conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, were special targets. The Inquisition suspected many conversos of secretly practicing Judaism while outwardly conforming to Christianity. They'd investigate conversos' private behaviour, look for evidence of Jewish practices, arrest those suspected, and torture them to extract confessions of Judaizing. The evidence sought was often trivial: lighting candles on Friday evening, refusing to eat pork, wearing clean clothes on Saturday. Under torture, conversos might confess to these practices, which were then used to convict them of heresy. Their property would be confiscated, they'd be publicly humiliated in auto da fe ceremonies, and sometimes they'd be burned at stake. Muslims in Christian territories faced similar persecution. After the Christian reconquest of Spain, Muslims were gradually pressured to convert. Those who converted, called Moriscos, were suspected of secret Islamic practice, just as conversos were suspected of secret Judaism. The Inquisition investigated, tortured and punished Moriscos for decades until they were finally expelled from Spain entirely in 1609. Political torture was constant throughout the medieval period. Accused traitors faced the worst tortures because treason was the highest crime. Suspected conspirators were tortured to reveal fellow plotters. Political prisoners were tortured to extract information about foreign enemies, about plots against the king, about seditious activities. The line between extracting genuine information and forcing false confessions was often non-existent. A person being tortured would say anything to make it stop, including naming innocent people as conspirators. Those people would then be arrested and tortured, and they'd name others. Political purges could be driven by chains of tortured confessions implicating ever-widening circles of supposed traitors. The gunpowder plot investigation in England exemplified this. After the plot to blow up Parliament was discovered in 1605, authorities arrested suspected conspirators and tortured them brutally. Guy Fawkes was racked until he confessed and named accomplices. Those accomplices were arrested and tortured until they confessed and named others. The government used torture to map out the conspiracy's full extent, but also to create evidence justifying harsh treatment of Catholics generally. Torture of witnesses was also practiced in some jurisdictions. If someone claimed to have information about a crime but refused to testify, or seemed to be lying, they might be tortured to compel truthful testimony. This seems obviously counterproductive, since torture would produce whatever testimony the torturer wanted. But medieval courts apparently believed pain compelled truth. Debt collection sometimes involved torture. In some places, debtors who refused to pay could be imprisoned and tortured until they revealed hidden assets or arranged for payment. This wasn't technically judicial torture, since it wasn't part of criminal proceedings, but it shows how torture permeated medieval society beyond formal legal contexts. Private torture by feudal lords was technically illegal, but widely practiced. A lord with power over their lands might torture peasants suspected of poaching, theft, or other offences. They might torture to extract confessions, to punish, or simply to terrorise their subjects into obedience. The line between legitimate judicial authority and arbitrary violence was often blurred, particularly in remote areas where royal authority was weak. Some of the most disturbing medieval torture involved animals. Accused criminals might be confined with animals that would attack them. Snakes, rats, dogs, and other creatures were used. The practice of rat torture involved placing rats in a container against the victim's body and heating the container, causing the rats to gnaw through the victim trying to escape the heat. This practice may be more legend than documented history, but it appears in enough sources to suggest it happened at least occasionally. The psychological horror of being eaten alive by animals combined with physical agony created particularly memorable suffering. Whether medieval torturers actually used this technique regularly, or whether later writers embellished occasional occurrences, remains debated. Animals were also executed for crimes in bizarre medieval proceedings. A pig that killed a child might be arrested, tried in court, and executed publicly, often by hanging. These animal trials seem absurd, but they reflected medieval ideas about justice and moral responsibility that differed fundamentally from modern thinking. If justice required punishment of wrongdoers, and if animals could do wrong, then animals should be punished. The connection between animal trials and torture was that both reflected a worldview where justice was about balancing scales, about ensuring wrongdoing was met with proportional suffering regardless of whether that suffering served any practical purpose. Modern justice systems claim to focus on deterrence, rehabilitation, and public safety. Medieval justice focused on retribution, on cosmic balance, on demonstrating that evil acts inevitably led to suffering. Economic crimes faced torture and harsh punishment. Counterfeiting was particularly serious because it struck at royal authority. The king's prerogative to control currency. Convicted counterfeiters might be boiled alive in oil or water, a punishment specific to counterfeiters in many jurisdictions. The boiling was done in a large cauldron, the victim lowered in gradually to prolong suffering. Poisoners faced similar fates. Poisoning was considered especially heinous because it was cowardly, secretive, difficult to prove and often targeted the powerful who could afford the expensive foods that might be poisoned. Convicted poisoners might be burned alive or subjected to other extreme punishments, designed to match their crime's perceived severity. Infanticide was treated with particular harshness. Women convicted of killing their infants might be buried alive, drowned, or subjected to other terrible executions. The reasoning combined the severity of murder with gendered assumptions about maternal duty and women's moral weakness. A woman who killed her child had violated natural law, maternal instinct and divine will, deserving the most terrible punishment. The reality was often more complex. Many women convicted of infanticide were unmarried women who had concealed pregnancies, given birth alone, and whose babies died from neglect or exposure. Whether these were deliberate murders or desperate attempts to hide shameful situations was often unclear, but medieval law provided no middle ground between complete innocence and capital punishment for infanticide. Spousal murder was treated differently based on gender. A man who murdered his wife faced execution, but through methods used for ordinary murder. A woman who murdered her husband was guilty of petty treason, since a wife owed her husband the same obedience a subject owed the king. Petty treason warranted the same punishment as high treason, being burned alive in England or other aggravated forms of execution elsewhere. This gender disparity in punishment for the same crime reveals how thoroughly patriarchal assumptions permeated medieval law. Killing one's spouse was murder, but a wife killing her husband was also rebellion against divinely ordained authority. The wife had violated the social order at a fundamental level, challenging the hierarchy that placed her under her husband's authority. Sodomy, defined broadly to include various sexual acts considered unnatural, faced death penalty in most medieval jurisdictions. The punishment was often burning at the stake, the same punishment as heresy, reflecting the belief that sexual deviation was both crime and sin. Some jurisdictions prescribed different punishments: castration, being thrown from heights, being torn apart by horses. Accusations of sodomy could be politically motivated. Enemies could be destroyed by accusing them of unnatural acts. The Knights Templar were arrested en masse in France in 1307, partly on charges of sodomy and heresy. Under torture, many Templars confessed to various sexual and heretical acts. These confessions were almost certainly false, extracted through torture, but they provided legal justification for suppressing the order and seizing their wealth. The Templar case shows how torture enabled political persecution. King Philip IV of France wanted the Templars' wealth and viewed their power as threatening. Accusing them of heresy and sodomy, then torturing confessions from them, created legal cover for what was essentially a political and financial attack. Dozens of Templars were burned at stake. The order was dissolved. The king claimed their property. War brought its own tortures. Captured soldiers might be tortured for information about enemy plans, troop strengths, fortification details. Besieging armies tortured captured defenders to find weaknesses in fortifications or to terrorize those still holding out. Civilians in conquered territories faced torture and violence from occupying forces. The laws of war provided some protections, at least in theory. Knights captured in battle were supposed to be treated as valuable prisoners to be ransomed, not tortured or killed. But these protections applied inconsistently. Knights captured by those of much lower social status, like peasant militias, might be killed rather than ransomed. And protections that applied to knights certainly didn't extend to common soldiers, much less to civilians. Siege warfare created horrific situations. Cities under siege faced starvation. Defenders knew that if the city fell by assault rather than negotiated surrender, they could expect no mercy. Attackers who lost men taking walls by force would massacre the defenders and often the civilian population. This threat meant sieges often ended only when defenders were too weakened by hunger and disease to fight, and attackers were willing to offer terms that allowed the garrison to leave safely. But before reaching that point, there might be torture. Defenders might torture captured attackers and display their bodies on walls to intimidate besiegers. Attackers might torture captured defenders in view of the walls, trying to break the garrison's morale. Neither side could claim moral superiority. Both used whatever means seemed likely to achieve their goals. The Crusades brought Christian and Muslim military forces into sustained contact, and both sides practiced torture. Captured crusaders were sometimes tortured by Muslim forces, Captured Muslims were tortured by crusaders. Both sides justified this by portraying the enemy as infidels deserving no mercy. The religious nature of the conflict intensified the brutality rather than moderating it. When crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099, they massacred the population, Muslims and Jews alike. Contemporary accounts describe blood running in the streets, piles of bodies, wholesale slaughter of people who had surrendered. While this was massacre more than torture, the systematic nature and the religious justification connect it to the broader pattern of violence legitimized by medieval culture. Torture wasn't confined to military and judicial contexts. Slavery existed throughout the medieval period, though its forms varied by region. Slavs captured by German forces were enslaved, giving us the word slave from Slav. Muslims and Christians enslaved each other in Mediterranean conflicts. African slaves were transported to Europe and the Middle East. These slaves faced torture as punishment for resistance, for attempted escape, for any perceived transgression. Galley slaves, chained to oars in Mediterranean warships, lived in conditions that were themselves a form of torture. They rowed under threat of whipping, with inadequate food and water, chained in place even when not rowing, sleeping at their oars, rowing until they died or were no longer useful and were thrown overboard. This was legal, systematic, and continued for centuries. Domestic servants, while not slaves in many contexts, often faced brutal treatment including torture for theft or other offences. A noble household might include dozens of servants, and maintaining discipline over them could involve whipping, beating, confinement, and worse. The line between legitimate discipline and illegal torture was often unclear, and servants had little recourse against abusive masters. Children faced violence that would be considered torture by modern standards, but was accepted as discipline. Beating children with sticks, whips, or other implements was normal in homes, schools, and monasteries. The idea that sparing the rod spoiled the child was taken literally. Some pedagogical treatises recommended specific beating schedules and techniques to properly discipline students. Monastic discipline included corporal punishment for monks and nuns who violated rules. The chapter meeting, a regular monastic gathering, might include confessions of faults, followed by prescribed penances. These penances could include being beaten, being confined in isolation, being fed only bread and water, or other physical hardships designed to correct behaviour and save souls. Some monastic orders were harsher than others. The Carthusians practiced extreme austerity, including regular self-flagellation and very limited food. The Cistercians followed strict rules including corporal punishment for infractions. These practices were voluntary in the sense that monks chose to enter these orders, but once professed, they had little choice but to submit to the discipline or face being returned to the secular world in disgrace. Religious ecstatics and mystics sometimes engaged in extreme self-torture, viewing physical suffering as a path to spiritual enlightenment. They'd wear hair shirts that abraded skin constantly. They'd fast to the point of starvation. They'd sleep on stone floors in unheated rooms. They'd whip themselves until they bled. St. Catherine of Siena reportedly slept only every other night and ate almost nothing, punishing her body to purify her soul. These practices were praised as holy discipline, as evidence of spiritual devotion. The same actions forced on someone against their will would be torture, but when self-inflicted they were piety. This paradox reveals the complicated medieval relationship with suffering, where pain could be punishment, purification, or proof of devotion depending on context and intent. The cult of martyrdom reinforced these ideas. Saints' lives featured detailed descriptions of martyrs' tortures, often exaggerated or invented. St. Lawrence was supposedly roasted on a gridiron and joked about being done on one side. St. Catherine of Alexandria had her bones broken on a wheel. St. Sebastian was shot with arrows. These stories were retold in sermons, depicted in art, commemorated in feast days. The message was that faithful Christians should be willing to suffer for their beliefs, that torture by pagans or heretics proved, rather than disproved, one's faith. This created a cultural framework where suffering was valorized, where enduring torture demonstrated moral superiority. It's a short step from celebrating martyrs' ability to withstand torture to inflicting torture on others and expecting them to endure it as a spiritual test. Medieval medical practice sometimes resembled torture. Surgery without anesthesia meant operations were agonizing experiences. Patients had to be held down while surgeons cut, sawed, and cauterized. The pain was overwhelming. Many people died from shock during or after surgery. Those who survived the operation faced high risks of infection from non-sterile conditions. Bloodletting, based on humoral theory, was common medical treatment involving cutting veins to release bad blood. While not intended as torture, repeated bloodletting weakened patients and sometimes killed them. Cauterization of wounds with hot irons caused terrible pain. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was performed for various conditions and must have been excruciating. Mentally ill people faced treatment that would be considered torture. They might be confined in chains, beaten to drive out demons believed to cause madness, subjected to exorcisms involving physical abuse. The line between treatment and punishment was non-existent for the mentally ill. They were dangerous, possessed, or morally weak, and harsh treatment was thought necessary and appropriate. Lepers faced social exclusion that functioned as psychological torture. Required to wear identifying clothing, to ring bells warning of their approach, to live in leper colonies separate from healthy people. They were legally and socially dead despite being physically alive. Some jurisdictions held funeral services for people diagnosed with leprosy before exiling them, treating them as dead to their families and communities. The disabled faced similar social marginalization and sometimes physical abuse. Physical disability was often interpreted as divine punishment for sin, making disabled people objects of shame and contempt rather than compassion. Begging was often their only option, and even that was increasingly regulated and restricted as the medieval period progressed. Let's examine torture's relationship to medieval science and proto-forensics. Autopsies were rare but did occur, particularly in cases of suspected poisoning or mysterious death. Bodies would be opened and examined, initially for medical and legal purposes, but the boundary between legitimate investigation and violation of the corpse was unclear. Some autopsies seemed motivated by curiosity or vindictiveness rather than necessity. Human dissection for anatomical study faced religious objections but occurred increasingly toward the end of the medieval period. Executed criminals' bodies were used for dissection, which was considered an additional punishment beyond death. The criminal's body couldn't receive proper burial, but would be cut apart for medical students to examine. This posthumous violation was seen as fitting for someone who had violated social order. The bodies of holy people were sometimes dismembered after death to create multiple relics. A saint's body might be divided among several churches, with different institutions claiming an arm, a finger, a tooth. This wasn't considered desecration, but rather spreading the saint's blessing. The contrast with treatment of criminals' bodies is stark. Saints were divided to honour them, criminals to dishonour them, but both involved cutting up human bodies. Mummification was practiced in some elite circles, preserving bodies of kings and nobles. The embalming process was invasive, removing organs, treating the body with chemicals, preparing it for long-term preservation. For those performing the work, it must have resembled butchery. The preserved bodies would be displayed sometimes for years before final burial. The medieval understanding of death was different from ours. Death wasn't necessarily instant or final in the modern sense. People might be declared dead, prepared for burial, and then revive. Stories circulated about people buried alive who clawed at coffin lids before actually dying. These stories fed into fears about premature burial that persisted into the modern era. Some torture methods specifically aimed to keep victims in a state between life and death, unable to fully die, but unable to continue living. Impalement achieved this when done skillfully. A sharpened stake would be inserted into the body, usually through the rectum, positioned carefully to avoid major blood vessels and vital organs. The victim would be left on the stake, gradually sliding further down under their own weight, the process taking hours or days before finally dying. Vlad III of Wallachia, called Vlad the Impaler, supposedly used this method extensively in the 15th century. Historical accounts, particularly from his enemies, describe forests of impaled victims. Modern historians debate how many of these accounts are accurate versus propaganda, but there's no doubt Vlad used impalement as both punishment and intimidation tactic. The Ottoman Empire also practiced impalement, though descriptions of their methods differ from European accounts. Ottoman impalement might be quicker or slower, depending on the executioner's skill and the Sultan's orders. The public nature was constant. Impaled bodies displayed on major roads, at city gates, places where they'd be seen by many people. Crucifixion, the Roman execution method used to kill Jesus, appeared occasionally in medieval times despite its Christian associations. Some accounts describe criminals being crucified, nailed to crosses and left to die slowly from exhaustion, exposure, and asphyxiation. Whether these were true crucifixions or hangings described using crucifixion terminology is often unclear from sources. The symbolic power of crucifixion made it especially complicated for Christian societies. Using the same method that killed Christ to execute criminals seemed either blasphemous or appropriate depending on interpretation. Some theologians argued that Christ's suffering sanctified crucifixion, making it a holy form of death. Others argued that crucifixion should never be used again because Christ had sanctified it uniquely. The debates were theological but had practical implications for execution methods. Starvation was both torture method and punishment. Prisoners might be left in cells with no food, allowed to die slowly of hunger. This was considered less direct than execution, a way of killing someone while technically not executing them. The prisoner died from neglect rather than active killing, a distinction that mattered legally and theologically. Some prisoners starved accidentally through incompetence or neglect rather than deliberate policy. Medieval prisons were often holes in the ground, dungeons in castle basements, spaces not designed for long-term habitation. Prisoners depended on guards or family members bringing food. If no one brought food, they starved. Whether this was murder, manslaughter, or just unfortunate depended on circumstances and who was making the determination. Thirst kills faster than starvation and is more agonizing. Denying prisoners water was recognized as torture, yet it happened regularly, again sometimes deliberately as punishment, sometimes through neglect. A prisoner forgotten in a cell would die of thirst within days, the death painful and degrading. Exposure to elements functioned similarly. Prisoners left in unheated cells during winter might freeze to death. Prisoners exposed to summer heat without shade or water might die from heat. These deaths could be blamed on weather rather than on those who imprisoned the victims, providing deniability while achieving the same end as execution. Sleep deprivation was recognized as a form of torture. Prisoners might be kept awake for days, guards ensuring they couldn't sleep. This method appeared particularly in witchcraft investigations, where sleep deprivation combined with other techniques to break the accused person's resistance. After several days without sleep, people hallucinate, become suggestible, can't think clearly. In this state, they'd confess to anything. The witchfinder Matthew Hopkins, operating in England in the 1640s after the medieval period proper, used sleep deprivation systematically. He'd walk accused witches back and forth for days, never allowing rest. They'd eventually confess to witchcraft, name accomplices, describe attending Sabbaths with the devil. These confessions were products of exhaustion, but they were treated as evidence and used to justify executions. Sensory deprivation through prolonged isolation in dark cells had similar effects. Humans are social creatures requiring stimulation. Locked alone in darkness for weeks or months, prisoners' minds deteriorated. Some went mad. Others became so desperate for human contact they'd confess to anything if it meant being taken from the cell and interacting with interrogators. The oubliette, a dungeon accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling, represented extreme isolation. Prisoners lowered into oubliettes might be forgotten, left until they died. The name comes from the French oublier, to forget. Whether oubliettes were actually common or more mythical than real is debated, but they appear in enough sources to suggest they existed in some castles. Torture's decline in the early modern period came partly from intellectual changes we've discussed, but also from practical concerns. As legal systems became more sophisticated, torture's unreliability became more obvious. False confessions led to wrongful convictions that were sometimes later discovered, undermining confidence in torture-derived evidence. The emergence of professional police forces and detective methods provided alternatives to torture for solving crimes. Instead of torturing suspects until they confessed, investigators could examine crime scenes, interview witnesses, build cases from physical evidence. These methods were slower, but more reliable, and they didn't require hurting people. The decline of religious uniformity in Europe after the Reformation also reduced torture's justification. When countries included both Catholic and Protestant subjects, using torture to enforce religious conformity became more complicated. Torturing Protestants in Catholic countries provoked Protestant countries and vice versa. Political considerations eventually outweighed religious ones, leading to more tolerance and less torture. But torture's decline was not linear or universal. Even as some countries abolished judicial torture, others maintained it. Even countries that abolished it legally might practice it illegally. Colonies used torture long after the metropole banned it. Military forces used torture even when civilian courts couldn't. The proud declaration that torture was a relic of dark ages obscured its continuing practice. The medieval legacy of torture persists in modern times more than we like to admit. The techniques perfected over those 1,000 years didn't disappear. They evolved, became more psychological, got renamed, but the essential practice of inflicting pain to compel compliance or extract information continued. Enhanced interrogation techniques used in the War on Terror included waterboarding, which we've noted is medieval water torture with a modern name. They included stress positions where prisoners were forced into painful postures for hours, similar to medieval standing torture. They included sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, sensory deprivation, all techniques with medieval precedents. The justifications also echoed medieval thinking. Torture's defenders argued that extraordinary threats required extraordinary measures, that getting information quickly was worth moral costs, that those subjected to torture were enemies deserving no mercy. Medieval torturers said the same about heretics, traitors, and criminals. The specifics changed, but the logic remained. What changed was openness. Medieval torture was public, legal, documented. Modern torture is hidden, officially denied, leaving minimal documentation. Medieval authorities believed torture was just and wanted people to know it was being used. Modern authorities claim torture is wrong, but practice it anyway and work to hide that practice. This makes medieval torture in some ways more honest. Medieval society said, "We torture criminals and heretics because they deserve it, and because it serves justice and God's will." Modern society says, "We don't torture because it's wrong," while secretly torturing and calling it something else. Both tortured, but medieval society was at least transparent about it. As we reach the end of this journey through 1,000 years of suffering, what can we take away? Human capacity for cruelty is limitless. Given sufficient justification, whether religious, legal, political, or security-based, humans can inflict terrible pain on other humans and sleep soundly. The torturer goes home to family dinner. The judge who authorized torture attends church. The spectator who watched an execution plays with their children. Cruelty doesn't require monsters, just ordinary people who believe their cause justifies their methods. The medieval period wasn't uniquely cruel. It was uniquely open about its cruelty, willing to describe and defend practices that later ages preferred to hide. Reading medieval sources on torture is disturbing not just because of what they describe, but because of how matter-of-factly they describe it. Torture manuals read like cookbooks, listing methods and procedures without moral anguish or justification. It was simply part of justice, like trials or evidence. We like to think we've moved beyond medieval brutality, that we're more civilized, more humane, more enlightened. But torture continues worldwide. It's illegal nearly everywhere, condemned in international treaties, supposedly unacceptable in civilized nations. Yet it persists, hidden in police stations, in military prisons, in secret facilities. The techniques evolve, but the practice remains. The 1,000 years of medieval torture we've explored aren't safely in the past. They're prologue to modern torture, foundation for contemporary cruelty. Understanding medieval torture isn't just historical curiosity, it's recognizing patterns that continue, justifications that recur, human capacity for rationalized violence that persists across centuries. If you've stayed through this entire exploration of humanity's darkest practices, thank you. These aren't easy stories. This isn't comfortable history, but it's necessary history worth understanding even when it disturbs. The past shapes the present. The torture chambers of medieval castles connect to modern black sites. The Inquisitors' manuals connect to modern interrogation guidelines. The crowds watching public executions connect to modern publics turning blind eyes to state violence. Wherever you are, whatever time it is there now, remember that the capacity for cruelty isn't medieval or modern, it's human. We're all capable of terrible things given the right circumstances, sufficient justification, appropriate social permission. Understanding torture's history means recognizing that possibility in ourselves, that complacency enables cruelty, that ordinary people perpetrated and witnessed extraordinary violence throughout history and continue doing so today. The medieval period ended centuries ago, but torture didn't end with it. The 1,000 years we've examined established patterns, refined techniques, created justifications that outlasted the Middle Ages. Torture went underground but didn't disappear. It changed names, but not nature. It's illegal, but persistent. It's condemned, but practiced. Learning this history means recognizing torture's continuity, its resilience, its ability to adapt and survive across dramatically different societies and eras. As you rest, as you process these stories, consider how much progress is real and how much is illusion, how much change is substantive and how much cosmetic. Consider what future generations will say about our time, what practices we've normalized that later eras will condemn, what cruelties we've hidden from ourselves. The medieval period gave us 1,000 years of torture. The modern era has given us more centuries of the same, just better hidden and more thoroughly denied. Thank you for taking this dark journey through history. Thank you for not looking away from uncomfortable truths. And remember that understanding the past is the first step toward building a different future. That knowing what humans have done to each other helps us recognize and resist such behavior today. The 1,000 years of medieval torture cast long shadows. We still live in those shadows. Only by acknowledging them can we begin to step into light. But there are more layers to this history, more contexts that shaped how torture developed and persisted. The economic dimensions of torture reveal how suffering became systematized, not just through cruelty, but through profit and bureaucracy. Executioners, torturers, jailers, all operated within economic systems that created incentives for torture's continuation. Executioners earned fees for each execution and torture session. In some jurisdictions, they received payment per method used, creating incentive to employ multiple techniques. An executioner might earn more for breaking on the wheel than for simple beheading, more for prolonged torture than quick confession. This turned suffering into a commodity, measured and priced. Torturers maintained their equipment, and these devices were investments. A well-constructed rack might serve for decades. An Iron Maiden, if it existed, would represent significant metalworking expense. Even simple tools like whips, chains, and branding irons required purchase and maintenance. These costs were typically borne by municipalities or lords, who expected return on investment through effective intimidation and social control. Prisons generated revenue through prisoner fees. In many places, prisoners had to pay for their own incarceration, buying food, bedding, even their chains from jailers. Wealthy prisoners could purchase comfortable quarters, better food, fewer restrictions. Poor prisoners suffered in dungeons, received minimal sustenance, languished in chains. Justice became explicitly tiered by wealth, with torture falling most heavily on those who couldn't pay to avoid it. Families of the condemned sometimes had to pay for the execution itself, purchasing the wood for burning, the rope for hanging, even paying the executioner's fee. This added financial devastation to emotional trauma. A family lost a member and went into debt paying for their death. Some families couldn't afford proper execution, leaving their condemned relative to suffer through whatever cheaper method was available. The confiscation of property from condemned criminals created perverse incentives. If a person was convicted of heresy, treason, or other serious crimes, their property might be forfeited to the state or the church. This gave authorities financial motivation to pursue convictions, to torture confessions, to execute property owners. The Spanish Inquisition funded itself partly through such confiscations, creating direct incentive to find people guilty of heresy. This economic aspect meant torture and execution weren't just about justice or social control. They were revenue sources, job creation, economic activity. Towns competed for the right to hold executions because execution days brought crowds, and crowds meant business for local merchants. The economics of death created constituencies who benefited from torture's continuation. The specialization of torture work created professional knowledge passed between practitioners. Executioner dynasties accumulated techniques across generations. They knew which bones to break in which order for maximum pain but sustained life. They understood how much weight the human frame could bear on the rack before permanent damage occurred. They perfected the art of calibrated suffering. This professionalization meant torture techniques improved over time in the sense of becoming more effective at achieving their aims. Early medieval torture was crude, often killing too quickly or causing damage that prevented the victim from providing useful confession. Later medieval torture became more sophisticated, more controlled, more precisely calibrated to extract maximum confession with minimal permanent injury. Torture manuals documented these refinements. The Carolina Code, promulgated in the Holy Roman Empire in 1532, at the end of the medieval period, codified torture procedures with remarkable detail. It specified which crimes warranted torture, what evidence was required before torture could be authorized, how long torture sessions could last, what methods were permissible. This legalization and documentation shows torture's evolution from ad hoc violence to regulated procedure. The Carolina Code's torture provisions included safeguards meant to prevent abuse. Torture required judicial authorization. The accused had to be confronted with evidence before torture. Medical personnel had to be present. Confessions extracted under torture had to be confirmed afterward. These rules sound protective, but in practice they legitimize torture by making it seem regulated and fair. Other jurisdictions developed similar codes. France's Criminal Ordinance of 1670 detailed torture procedures extensively. Spanish Inquisition rules governed torture's application. These weren't rogue torturers acting sadistically. They were officials following written procedures, documented and legal. This bureaucratization of torture made it more persistent because it was woven into legal systems rather than depending on individual cruelty. The geographic variation in torture practices across medieval Europe reveals how local customs and legal traditions shaped suffering's specific forms. Italian city-states developed different torture traditions than German principalities. English common law's restrictions on torture contrasted with continental European practice. Spanish methods differed from French methods, which differed from methods in Eastern Europe. These variations weren't arbitrary. They reflected different legal philosophies, different religious influences, different social structures. Roman law traditions in southern Europe emphasized written procedures and judicial oversight. Germanic legal customs in northern Europe maintained older traditions of ordeal and combat, alongside newer torture techniques. Each region adapted torture to its particular legal culture. The adoption of Roman law in many European regions during the High Middle Ages brought with it Roman torture practices. Roman law had permitted torture of slaves and, in some cases, lower-class citizens. Medieval Europe expanded these precedents, creating elaborate torture procedures based partly on Roman models, partly on innovation. The revival of Roman law thus contributed to torture's systematization. Canon law, the Church's legal system, also addressed torture. Church courts could use torture to extract confessions from accused heretics and other religious offenders. But canon law theoretically prohibited shedding blood, creating a legal fiction where church officials ordered torture, but secular authorities carried it out. This allowed the church to benefit from torture while maintaining the pretense of not directly engaging in bloodshed. The relationship between secular and ecclesiastical courts around torture was often cooperative. A suspect might be tried in church court, tortured, convicted, then handed to secular authorities for execution. This division of labour let church officials avoid direct responsibility for death, while ensuring heretics were punished. The phrase, "relaxed to the secular arm," described this handoff, a euphemism for sending someone to execution. Universities, which emerged in the medieval period, trained lawyers who became judges and inquisitors. These educated officials read classical texts on law, studied theology, learned legal theory and procedure. Their education included learning when and how torture could be applied. Law schools taught torture as part of standard curriculum. This academic legitimization made torture intellectually respectable among the educated classes. Legal theorists debated torture's ethics and effectiveness, but most accepted it as necessary. They argued about limitations, about proper procedures, about which crimes warranted torture. But the underlying premise that torture was acceptable within proper boundaries was rarely questioned. The intellectual framework supporting torture was as important as the physical devices in making it systemic and enduring. The role of physicians in torture deserves closer examination. Medical knowledge was essential for effective torture. Knowing human anatomy meant knowing how to inflict maximum pain without killing. Understanding physiology meant recognizing when a victim was close to death and needed respite. Torturers with medical knowledge were more valuable than those without. Some physicians served as consultants to torturers, advising on techniques, monitoring victims' condition, recommending when to continue or stop. This medical involvement created ethical paradoxes. Physicians took oaths to do no harm, yet they helped torturers harm more effectively. They preserved life, but only so torture could continue. They prevented death during torture, while knowing the victim would later be executed. These physician torturers justified their participation by arguing they were preventing unnecessary death, ensuring torture didn't accidentally kill before confession was extracted. By monitoring the victim's condition and stopping before death, they claimed to be acting mercifully. This rationalization allowed medical professionals to participate in torture while maintaining their identity as healers. The boundaries between medicine and torture were culturally permeable in ways modern medical ethics tries to make impermeable. The Hippocratic Oath's prohibition on harm was interpreted to allow torture that served legal justice. After all, these physicians reasoned, wasn't extracting confession from a guilty criminal a social good? Wasn't preventing crime through deterrence a form of collective healing? Modern medical ethics prohibits physician participation in torture, yet it still occurs. Military physicians in various countries have been documented assisting interrogations, monitoring detainees' health during enhanced interrogation, advising interrogators. The medieval pattern of medical knowledge being used to enable torture, rather than prevent it, persists despite stronger ethical prohibitions. Let's explore torture in the context of medieval social hierarchies more deeply. Social class profoundly affected one's likelihood of being tortured and the forms that torture took. Nobles had legal protections that peasants lacked. A noble accused of crime might face trial by combat or judgment by peers rather than torture. A peasant accused of the same crime would likely be tortured. This wasn't hypocrisy in medieval eyes, it was natural hierarchy. Nobles were considered different in kind from commoners, not just in degree. They had refined sensibilities, delicate constitutions, honour to protect. Torturing a noble was degrading in ways that torturing a peasant wasn't. When nobles were tortured, it was extraordinary, shocking, evidence that normal social rules had broken down. The torture and execution of nobles usually involved methods considered more honourable. Beheading was a nobleman's death. Hanging was for commoners. Breaking on the wheel was for peasants who committed heinous crimes. Burning was for heretics regardless of class, though nobles might receive the mercy of strangulation before the fire was lit while peasants burned alive. These distinctions reinforced social hierarchy even in death. A noble's superior breeding was honoured by superior execution. A peasant's low birth was reflected in degrading death. The same crime received radically different punishment depending on the criminal's social position, and this seemed just and natural to medieval society. Women's social position created specific vulnerabilities to torture. Women had fewer legal rights than men, were considered weaker, and more susceptible to deception by the devil. These beliefs made women likely targets for witchcraft accusations and subsequent torture. The witch trials disproportionately affected women because medieval society viewed women as spiritually vulnerable and morally weak. Sexual torture and humiliation of women occurred, though it's less documented than other forms. Women accused of sexual crimes or witchcraft might be stripped naked, examined for devil's marks, subjected to assaults that combined interrogation with violation. Male authorities conducting these examinations and tortures had power that enabled abuse beyond even the torture's official purpose. The language around torturing women often emphasized their bodies in ways that torture of men didn't. Women were described as breaking more easily, confessing more quickly, being less able to withstand pain. Whether this reflected actual gender differences in pain tolerance or gender stereotypes about female weakness is unclear. What's clear is that these beliefs shaped how women experienced torture and how society understood female criminality. Pregnant women presented particular challenges. Canon law theoretically protected pregnant women from torture and execution until after birth. This protection was practical as well as moral, the unborn child being innocent even if the mother was guilty. But this protection was inconsistently applied. Some jurisdictions tortured pregnant women, some executed them despite pregnancy. The child's innocence wasn't always sufficient shield against the mother's guilt. Children accused of crimes faced torture in some jurisdictions. The age at which someone was considered legally responsible varied, but children as young as 7 could face criminal prosecution in some places. Child witches were particularly vulnerable, both to accusation and to torture. The idea that children could be witches seems especially cruel to modern sensibilities, but it followed logically from medieval beliefs about the devil's power to corrupt anyone. The torture of children followed similar patterns to adult torture, but with adjustments for their smaller bodies. Devices might be scaled down, torture duration might be shortened. But the fundamental practices remained. Children were racked, beaten, burned, subjected to the same methods as adults. Their youth might earn some mercy, or might be seen as evidence of the devil's particular malevolence in corrupting the young. Families forced to witness members being tortured face psychological torture themselves. A parent watching their child tortured, a child watching their parent executed, spouses forced to witness each other's suffering. These experiences traumatized families and communities, spreading torture's impact far beyond the direct victim. This collective trauma served authorities' purposes by terrifying entire populations into compliance. Some torture specifically involved family. Parents might be threatened with their children's torture to compel confession. Children might be tortured in parents' presence to break parental resistance. Spouses might be tortured sequentially, each forced to watch the other suffer. These tactics weaponized family bonds, turning love into leverage for extracting confession. The destruction of family units through torture and execution affected communities for generations. Children orphaned by executions faced stigma and poverty. Widows of executed criminals struggled to survive. Extended families bore the shame of having a relative convicted of heresy or treason. The social death preceded and outlasted the physical death, destroying networks of relationship and support. Let's examine torture in monastic contexts more thoroughly. Monasteries and convents were supposed to be places of peace, but they had their own systems of discipline and punishment. Monks and nuns who violated rules faced corporal punishment, confinement, reduced rations, and other penalties that could amount to torture even if not called that. The monastic chapter meeting, where members confessed faults and received penalties, created a formalized system for administering punishment. A monk might confess to speaking unnecessarily and receive lashes. A nun might confess to pride and be confined to her cell on bread and water. These punishments were justified as necessary for spiritual discipline and community order. Some monastic penalties were severe: perpetual imprisonment within the monastery for serious violations, reduction to lay status and expulsion, physical punishments that caused lasting injury. The closed nature of monastic communities meant abuse could occur with little outside oversight. A cruel abbot or abbess could create a regime of terror, and monks or nuns had limited recourse. Monastic discipline manuals detailed appropriate penalties for various infractions. These texts read similarly to secular legal codes, listing offences and prescribed punishments. The continuity between monastic discipline and secular justice reflects how thoroughly punishment permeated medieval culture. The same logic that justified torturing heretics justified beating monks. The same administrative precision, the same assumption that controlled violence served righteous purposes. Anchorites and hermits who pursued extreme asceticism sometimes engaged in self-torture that would be diagnosed as mental illness today. They might wear chains that abraded skin, sleep on beds of thorns, deny themselves food and water to dangerous degrees. These practices were praised as holy discipline, but they represented deliberate self-harm motivated by religious belief. The veneration of these extreme ascetics sent a message that suffering was spiritually valuable. If the holiest people inflicted terrible suffering on themselves, perhaps suffering inflicted by others could also be spiritually beneficial. This logic helped justify torture of heretics and criminals as potentially redemptive, the pain purifying them before death. Pilgrimage was sometimes assigned as penance, but it could shade into punishment. A person might be required to walk to Jerusalem or Santiago de Compostela, a journey of months or years requiring resources many didn't have. The physical hardship of pilgrimage, sleeping rough, begging for food, walking hundreds of miles served as both penance and punishment. Some never completed their pilgrimages, dying on the road. Judicial pilgrimage was assigned by courts as alternative to other punishments. Instead of execution or mutilation, a convicted criminal might be sentenced to pilgrimage. This was supposedly merciful, but it was also exile, removing the criminal from their community and sending them into dangerous travel. Many judicial pilgrims never returned, dying during the journey or establishing new lives elsewhere. The Crusades functioned similarly for some participants. Taking the cross could commute other penalties. A person convicted of serious crimes might have their sentence reduced or eliminated by joining a crusade. This served multiple purposes. It removed dangerous people from communities, it provided soldiers for the crusades, and it offered criminals a path to redemption through holy war. But crusading was brutal. The journey to the Holy Land was dangerous, with many dying before reaching their destination. Battle was deadly. Disease killed more crusaders than combat. The crusader kingdoms were always desperate for soldiers because so many died. Commuting a sentence to crusade was often a delayed death sentence, just executed by Arabs or disease rather than the state. The moral logic of the Crusades connected to torture's justifications. If killing Muslims in holy war was meritorious, a way to earn salvation, then perhaps torturing heretics could be similarly justified. Both aimed at defending and extending Christian faith. Both involved violence against perceived enemies of God. The Crusades normalized religious violence in ways that supported torture's use against religious dissidents closer to home. Torture during the Crusades themselves was common. Crusaders tortured captured Muslims for information, for ransom demands, sometimes for entertainment. Muslim forces tortured captured Crusaders. The religious nature of the conflict meant each side viewed the other as damned anyway, making their suffering less morally concerning. If your enemy was going to hell regardless, why show mercy in this life? The military orders, the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, participated in torture as both perpetrators and victims. They tortured prisoners in the Holy Land. They were tortured by Muslim captors. When the Templars were suppressed in 1307, many were tortured to extract confessions. The full circle of torture, from those who inflicted it to those who suffered it, encompassed even warrior monks sworn to religious ideals. Siege warfare created unique torture opportunities and necessities. A castle under siege might run out of food and water. The garrison would face slow starvation, a form of collective torture. The besiegers might cut off all supplies, might poison wells, might use catapults to throw diseased animals or human remains over walls to spread disease. These tactics terrorized besieged populations and increased suffering. Hostages taken during sieges might be tortured or executed in view of the castle to pressure the garrison to surrender. A lord's children might be brought before the walls and threatened with torture or death unless the gates opened. This placed the defenders in impossible positions: surrender and face possible execution, or hold out and watch hostages suffer. Prisoners captured during sieges faced particular danger. If a castle fell by storm rather than negotiation, the attackers often massacred the garrison, and sometimes the civilian population. This was customary law, a way of encouraging surrender before assault. But it meant sieges became contests of endurance, where the losing side faced not just defeat but death, creating incentive to hold out longer and impose more suffering on both sides. Famine during extended sieges drove people to extremes. Stories circulate, perhaps exaggerated, of besieged populations resorting to eating rats, leather, eventually turning on each other. Whether these stories are accurate or not, they reflect siege warfare's capacity to reduce people to desperation through systematic deprivation, a form of collective torture. The aftermath of sieges could be as brutal as the sieges themselves. A captured castle might be sacked, its valuables stolen, its defenders killed, its civilians violated. This was partly revenge for the siege's costs, partly practical plunder, partly terrifying warning to other cities considering resistance. The sack of a city after siege represents collective punishment, mob violence sanctioned by military necessity. Let's return to specific torture methods we haven't fully explored. Pressing or peine forte dure appeared primarily in England. It was used for defendants who refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. By refusing to plead, they couldn't be tried and convicted, which meant their property couldn't be forfeited. To compel a plea, the court would place the defendant on their back and pile heavy stones on their chest until they agreed to plead or died. Some defendants chose to be pressed to death rather than plead, preserving their property for their heirs. Death by pressing was agonizing, the increasing weight making breathing difficult then impossible, ribs cracking, finally crushing the chest cavity. But it was legally distinct from execution for crime, allowing property to pass to heirs. This created a grim calculus. Die horribly, but leave your family provided for or plead and face trial where conviction meant both death and property confiscation. Giles Corey, during the Salem witch trials in 1692, was pressed to death for refusing to plead. He was 80 years old. For 2 days, weights were piled on a board laid across his chest. His alleged last words were, "More weight," refusing to save himself by pleading. Whether this happened as reported or as legend, the story represents the pressing's purpose, causing such terrible suffering that almost anyone would submit rather than endure it. The head crusher did what its name suggests, though whether it was widely used is debatable. The device placed the victim's skull in a vice that could be gradually tightened. Pressure would build, causing excruciating headache, then breaking teeth and jawbone, finally crushing the skull. Even if not tightened to death, the device could cause permanent damage while extracting confession through unbearable pain. Crushing feet was another method, placing feet in devices that could be tightened to break bones. The Spanish Inquisition used the boot, an iron or wooden device that enclosed the leg and could be gradually tightened or had wedges driven into it, crushing the leg bones. This torture left victims crippled even if they survived trial and execution. Finger screws worked on the same principle at smaller scale, crushing fingers until the bones broke. The thumb screw was a portable torture device, small enough to carry in a pocket, used to crush thumbs or fingers. Its portability made it convenient for interrogators, and its focused pain on sensitive areas made it effective despite its small size. These crushing devices shared a logic. They inflicted severe pain and permanent damage while requiring minimal effort from the torturer. A turn of a screw, a hammer blow on a wedge, simple mechanical advantage applied to vulnerable body parts. They were efficient torture, maximum suffering with minimum torturer labour, scalable to any strength level, limited only by the victim's eventual death or the torturer's decision to stop. Bone breaking by hand, without devices, was practiced in some contexts. An interrogator would break fingers individually until the victim confessed or all fingers were broken. The simplicity of this method meant it required no special equipment, just willingness to inflict pain directly. The intimacy of breaking someone's bones with your hands, feeling them crack, hearing the victim scream, demanded a particular kind of psychological hardness. The knee splitter was a device like a vice that enclosed the knee, and could be tightened to crush the kneecap and surrounding bones. The agony of crushed knees combined with permanent crippling. Even if the victim survived, they'd likely never walk properly again. This permanent damage served as both punishment and lasting reminder of the power wielded over them. The practice of hamstringing, cutting tendons behind the knee or ankle, permanently disabled victims while avoiding execution. This was sometimes done to captured soldiers to prevent them fighting again while keeping them alive. It was punishment for escaped slaves or prisoners, ensuring they couldn't run. The crippled victim served as warning to others while suffering lasting consequences of their transgression. Branding, which we've mentioned, deserves deeper examination for its permanent public nature. A brand marked someone for life, ensuring their crime followed them always. In societies where most people lived their entire lives in small communities, where everyone knew everyone, a brand was socially devastating. It marked the bearer as criminal, untrustworthy, dangerous. Employment became difficult. Marriage prospects vanished. The branded person lived as permanent outcast. Different crimes received different brands. A thief might be branded with T, a blasphemer with B, forgers with F, vagrants with V. These letter brands were usually placed on highly visible locations: forehead, cheek, hand. The point was public identification, ensuring the criminal couldn't hide their past. Some jurisdictions branded on the hand, allowing criminals to hide the brand in gloves or pockets. This was slightly more merciful, giving them some ability to move through society without constant identification. But a hand brand would be visible during any work requiring exposed hands, and deliberate hiding of a brand might itself be criminal. Branding's pain was intense but brief compared to other tortures. The hot iron pressed to skin caused immediate, terrible burning. The wound would blister, take weeks to heal, leave a permanent scar. Infection was common, sometimes fatal, but the physical pain ended relatively quickly. The social pain of being branded lasted forever. Some creative brands went beyond simple letters. The fleur-de-lis was branded on French criminals. Religious symbols might mark heretics. These symbolic brands carried meaning beyond simple identification, marking the bearer as having violated not just law, but sacred or cultural values. Tattooing served similar purposes in some cultures, marking criminals or slaves permanently. While less common in medieval Europe than branding, forced tattooing appeared in some contexts. The permanence and visibility were similar to branding, creating marked bodies that broadcast transgression. The removal of brands through cutting or burning was sometimes attempted by desperate criminals trying to escape their past. This was illegal and usually unsuccessful, the scar tissue from brand removal being as visible as the original brand. But the attempt itself shows how devastating permanent marking was to people's lives. Mutilation beyond branding took many forms. Cutting off ears was common punishment for various offences. Ears were visible, their removal obvious, and the disfigurement permanent. The victim could still work and function but bore visible mark of criminality. Slitting nostrils served similar purpose, disfiguring the face permanently while leaving the victim functional. Tongue removal or splitting punished perjury, blasphemy, seditious speech. A person whose tongue was removed or severely damaged couldn't speak clearly, limiting their ability to repeat their offence while marking them as linguistic criminals. The symbolism was clear. The instrument of the crime was destroyed. Castration punished sexual offences and was used to create eunuchs for specific social roles. As punishment, castration was devastating, removing not just the ability to commit future sexual offences, but also marking the victim as less than a full man in medieval society's gendered hierarchy. The physical pain and danger of the procedure combined with permanent social diminishment. Blinding was punishment for treason or serious crimes in some jurisdictions, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and medieval Mediterranean. Various methods were used: red-hot irons applied to eyes, sharp implements, corrosive substances. The result was permanent disability, making the victim dependent on others for survival while preventing them from future crime. The logic behind these mutilations was partly retributive, partly practical. The body part that sinned was removed or damaged. The thief's hand couldn't steal. The perjurer's tongue couldn't lie. The voyeur's eyes couldn't see. But mutilations also created permanent visible evidence of crime and punishment, walking reminders of the consequences of transgression. Medieval society's relationship with disfigured bodies was complex. Disfigurement from punishment marked criminal status, but disfigurement from disease, accident, or birth defects also marked people as cursed, touched by God's judgment. The permanently damaged body was read as text, evidence of moral or spiritual failure, even when the damage resulted from misfortune rather than punishment. This meant mutilated criminals joined a larger category of people whose bodies didn't conform to ideals. The scarred, the crippled, the blind, the disfigured, all existed on society's margins. Mutilation as punishment ensured criminals would join these marginalized groups permanently, suffering social death alongside whatever physical suffering the mutilation caused. The survival rate from mutilation varied. Cutting off a hand could be done relatively safely if properly cauterized, most victims surviving. Blinding, if done incorrectly, could cause fatal infections. Castration carried significant risk of bleeding to death or infection. The executioner's skill mattered enormously. A skilled professional could mutilate with minimal mortality. A clumsy amateur might kill most victims. Some mutilations were deliberately survivable, designed to let the victim live as a warning. Others were deliberately deadly, the mutilation serving as indirect execution. A person whose tongue was removed by an unskilled executioner might bleed to death, achieving execution while technically only performing mutilation. This ambiguity gave authorities flexibility, allowing them to kill while claiming they'd only intended to punish. The care of mutilated criminals after punishment was minimal. Some were simply released, left to survive or die on their own. Charitable institutions might take in some, providing basic care. Family might care for mutilated relatives if they were willing and able. But many mutilated criminals became beggars, displaying their disfigurement to generate pity and alms. Begging while displaying punishment-related disfigurement created a strange public dynamic. The criminal's suffering became spectacle again, this time to generate survival income rather than demonstrate justice. But this public display served authorities' purposes too, every mutilated beggar a walking advertisement of what happened to criminals. As we've journeyed through these 1,000 years, certain patterns emerge that connect medieval torture to broader historical forces. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the 14th century, created social chaos that intensified violence, including torture. The plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Social structures collapsed. Labour became scarce and valuable. Survivors faced trauma and uncertainty. In this environment, authorities used increased violence to maintain order. With fewer people, each potential worker was more valuable, yet authorities couldn't afford to appear weak. Torture and execution became more brutal, more public, more frequent. The spectacle of punishment reasserted order in a world that felt like it was ending. The plague also intensified scapegoating. Jews were accused of poisoning wells to cause the plague. Entire Jewish communities were tortured and killed. The flagellant movement spread, people whipping themselves publicly to appease God's wrath. Violence and suffering became mechanisms for processing collective trauma. The 100 Years' War between England and France created another context for increased torture. Long-term warfare meant constant suspicion of spies, traitors, and collaborators. Both sides tortured suspected enemies. Prisoners of war faced torture for information. Civilians in occupied territories faced torture from occupying forces. The war normalized violence for generations. Joan of Arc's trial and execution occurred during this war. She was captured by Burgundians allied with England, sold to the English, tried by church court for heresy, and burned at stake. Her trial included threats of torture, though apparently she wasn't actually tortured. But the threat was sufficient to break many prisoners, showing that psychological pressure could achieve what physical torture did. The Papal Schism and Avignon Papacy, which we discussed in the Vatican context, contributed to torture's religious justification. With multiple claimants to the papacy, each condemning the others as heretical, religious authority became fragmented and contested. In this environment, defining and punishing heresy became more urgent and more violent. The rise of centralized monarchies across Europe in the late medieval period meant increased state capacity for violence. Stronger governments with more efficient bureaucracies could implement torture more systematically. The torture chambers of strong states were better equipped, better staffed, more thoroughly documented than those of weaker feudal authorities. Printing's invention in the 15th century eventually contributed to torture's decline by making information more widely available and harder to control. But initially, printing enabled torture by making torture manuals and legal codes more accessible. Inquisitors could carry printed handbooks. Judges could reference printed legal precedents. The technology that would eventually help end torture first helped systematize it. The medieval period's end is conventionally placed around 1500. But torture didn't end with the Middle Ages. The early modern period, from 1500 to 1800, saw torture's continuation and in some ways intensification. The witch trials peaked in the 16th and 17th centuries, well after the medieval period. Religious wars following the Reformation created new justifications for torture. Colonial expansion brought European torture practices to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So when we speak of 1,000 years of medieval torture, we're really discussing the foundation for several more centuries of systematic violence. The techniques, the justifications, the bureaucratic practices, all established in the medieval period and carried forward. Torture didn't decline because medieval people were replaced by more enlightened modern people. It declined because social, political, and intellectual changes gradually made torture less useful and more problematic for those in power. Throughout all this history, one constant remains. Torture required ordinary people doing terrible things. The torturer might go home to family dinner, play with children, attend church, live a normal life except for their work. The judge who ordered torture might be learned, cultured, kind to friends and family. The executioner might be well liked in their community, respected for their skill. This ordinariness might be more disturbing than if torture was committed by monsters. It would be comforting to think that only evil people torture. The truth is that normal people torture when their society permits and requires it. Given appropriate authority, sufficient social permission, adequate justification, almost anyone can inflict terrible suffering. The torturer isn't psychologically abnormal. They're psychologically typical but operating in a system that makes cruelty normal. Understanding this means recognizing that torture doesn't require evil people. It requires systems that authorize torture, cultures that justify it, institutions that practice it. The individual torturer is less important than the social structure that creates and maintains the role of torturer. Ending torture requires changing systems, not just removing bad individuals. Medieval torture's 1,000-year span gave us extensive documentation of these systems. We can read the manuals, examine the legal codes, study the theological justifications, trace the economic incentives. This documentation lets us understand torture as social institution rather than individual aberration. And that understanding might be torture history's most important lesson. Evil is usually banal, systematic, rationalized, and normal, until later generations recognize it as evil. As we close this extended exploration, the question isn't whether medieval people were more cruel than us. They weren't. They were human, like us, capable of terrible things like us. The question is whether we've truly moved beyond medieval torture, or just hidden it better, renamed it, denied it more thoroughly. The question is whether our revulsion at medieval torture reflects genuine moral progress, or just moral smugness, the comfort of believing we're better than our ancestors while practicing similar violence under different names. The 1,000 years of medieval torture matter because they show how easily suffering becomes systematized, how readily humans accept cruelty when properly justified, how difficult it is to resist institutional violence even when you recognize it as wrong. These lessons remain relevant because the forces that created medieval torture, fear, desire for control, conviction of righteousness, economic incentives, bureaucratic efficiency, persist in modern societies. May we learn from this history. May we recognize torture's patterns when they appear in our own time. May we resist the justifications that make cruelty seem necessary or acceptable. And may we remember that the tortured victims of medieval centuries were humans like us, that their suffering was real and terrible, that it deserves to be remembered even when it disturbs us to remember it. Wherever you are, whatever time it is now, thank you for not looking away from these difficult truths. Thank you for bearing witness to suffering long past but not forgotten. And remember that understanding history's darkest chapters is how we prevent their repetition. That knowledge of medieval torture might help us recognize and resist contemporary torture. That the 1,000 years of suffering we've explored can teach us how to build a future with less suffering. The medieval torture chambers are empty now, dust and stone in castle basements. But their legacy persists in how we think about punishment, pain, justice, power. May we examine that legacy critically, learn its lessons fully, and build a world where torture's historical prevalence becomes impossible to replicate, where the 1,000 years of medieval torture serve as warning rather than model, as history rather than prologue. Yet there remain dimensions of this history we haven't fully explored, contexts that reveal how deeply torture penetrated every aspect of medieval life. The role of spectacle in torture and execution created a complex relationship between suffering and community, between violence and entertainment, between justice and theatre. Execution days were holidays. Courts scheduled executions for market days when crowds would already be gathered. People travelled from surrounding areas to watch. The condemned person's journey to the execution site became a procession. Crowds lining streets, following the cart or walking alongside. This wasn't merely morbid curiosity, though, that was certainly present. It was civic participation in justice, communal affirmation of social norms, collective witness to the wages of sin. The condemned person was expected to play their role in this theatre. They should confess their crimes, acknowledge the justice of their punishment, warn others not to follow their path and die penitently. A good death, meaning one where the criminal accepted their fate and died well, satisfied the crowd and reaffirmed social order. A bad death, where the criminal denied guilt or died badly, disturbed spectators and suggested something wrong with the proceedings. Executioners were showmen as much as technicians. They displayed their tools, explained what they would do, performed their work with flourishes designed to impress. A clean beheading with a single stroke earned applause. A hanging where the knot was tied perfectly demonstrated skill. Even torture became performance, the rack's turns measured and dramatic. the victims' responses noted and discussed by the crowd. Vendors sold food, drink, and souvenirs. Pieces of rope used in hangings were particularly valuable, believed to have magical or medicinal properties. People collected soil from execution sites, wood chips from scaffolds, any object connected to the execution. These relics of violence circulated in society, carrying execution's meaning into homes and daily life. Ballads and pamphlets about famous criminals and their executions were bestsellers. These publications described crimes in lurid detail, recounted the criminals' capture and trial, detailed their torture and execution, often including their supposed final words. The criminal became protagonist in a morality tale, their life and death converted into entertainment and instruction. Children attended executions. Parents brought them as educational experience, object lessons in the consequences of crime. Children learned that this is what happens to thieves, murderers, heretics. The normalized exposure to violence, treating execution as family outing, shaped how generations understood justice, authority, and the body's vulnerability to state power. Some spectators fainted, vomited, or fled, overwhelmed by the sight of suffering and death. But most watched attentively, discussing the proceedings, evaluating the executioner's skill, judging the condemned person's demeanor. The crowd's reactions mattered to authorities. A sympathetic crowd might riot to prevent execution. A hostile crowd might demand harsher treatment. Managing spectators was part of execution's challenge. The condemned person's final words were carefully recorded, at least for famous cases. These last speeches became part of historical record, repeated and discussed. The eloquent final speech could rehabilitate someone's reputation. A defiant final statement could make someone a martyr. The abject confession and plea for mercy could serve authorities' purposes. The power dynamics of execution extended even to the condemned person's last breaths. Some criminals achieved folk hero status despite or because of their execution. Robin Hood, whether historical or legendary, represents this phenomenon. Bandits, smugglers, and rebels became romantic figures in popular culture, their crimes reframed as resistance to unjust authority, their executions tragedies rather than justice. This romanticization disturbed authorities, who wanted criminals to be reviled, not celebrated. The body after execution carried continued meaning. It might be displayed at a prominent location, hung in chains at a crossroads, left to rot as a warning. It might be buried in unconsecrated ground, denied proper Christian burial. It might be dissected for medical study, cut apart for science. The criminal's body, even after death, served social purposes. Miracle stories sometimes attached to executed criminals, claims that the body didn't decay, that touching it produced healing, that lights appeared near the grave. These stories, whether believed or not, represented popular resistance to official narratives. If the executed person worked miracles, perhaps they weren't truly guilty. Perhaps the execution was unjust. These alternative narratives challenged authority while usually remaining safely in the realm of folk belief. Graveyards for executed criminals were grim places. Mass graves, unmarked, often in marshy or undesirable land. Criminals buried here were excluded even in death, denied the community of the churchyard. Their graves were believed by some to be haunted, dangerous, polluted by the evil of those buried there. Physical exclusion from sacred space represented spiritual exclusion from Christian community. Let's examine torture's relationship to emerging ideas about the body and soul in medieval thought. Scholastic philosophy, dominant in universities, debated the relationship between physical body and immortal soul. These debates had practical implications for torture. If the body was mere vessel for the soul, then damaging the body to save the soul could be justified. If pain purified, then torture was spiritual medicine. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential medieval theologian, wrote about punishment, including torture. He argued that punishment could be medicinal, reforming the sinner, or retributive, balancing scales of justice. Both purposes justified inflicting suffering. Aquinas accepted torture within limits, requiring proper authority and probable cause. His theological framework made torture intellectually respectable among the educated. The Aristotelian philosophy that influenced Aquinas included theories about the body's humours, about pain's nature, about the soul's relationship to physical sensation. These theories provided pseudoscientific justification for torture's effectiveness. If pain was simply excessive sensation in otherwise normal bodily processes, then applying pain systematically could produce desired psychological effects without damaging the soul. Debates about whether animals could feel pain, or whether their responses to injury were merely mechanical, affected how people understood pain generally. If animals were automata without true sensation, perhaps lower-class humans were similarly insensate. This dehumanizing logic made torturing peasants easier to justify. Their pain might not be fully real pain, might not matter morally the way noble suffering mattered. Medical theories about gender differences in pain tolerance influenced torture practices. Women were believed to have colder, moister humours, making them more susceptible to fear and pain. This belief justified using less severe torture on women to achieve the same effect as more severe torture on men. It also contributed to stereotypes about women's weakness, making accusations of witchcraft seem plausible, since weak women would more easily fall to the devil's temptations. The mortification of the flesh practiced by religious ascetics provided a model for understanding pain's spiritual value. If saints achieved holiness through self-torture, perhaps forcing similar suffering on sinners could bring them closer to God. The blurring of voluntary penance and involuntary torture reflected broader confusion about suffering's purpose and value. Theories of purgatory influenced thinking about earthly punishment. If souls in purgatory suffered to purge sin before entering heaven, then earthly suffering might serve similar purposes. Torture could be seen as temporal purgatory, burning away sin through pain, preparing the soul for judgment. This theological gymnastics made torture seem merciful, a gift to the tortured rather than cruelty. The visual arts of the medieval period depicted torture extensively. Religious art showed martyrs' tortures in graphic detail. Legal manuscripts illustrated torture methods. These images normalized torture visually, making it part of cultural vocabulary. Children grew up seeing torture depicted in church frescoes, learned to read using manuscripts decorated with execution scenes. The aestheticization of suffering in religious art is particularly disturbing. Beautiful paintings of St. Sebastian pierced with arrows, elegant sculptures of St. Lawrence on his gridiron, jeweled reliquaries containing martyrs' bones. The suffering that produced these relics was terrible, but the artistic treatment made it beautiful, sacred, desirable. This aesthetic transformation helped make real-world torture more acceptable. Passion plays depicting Christ's crucifixion became popular in the late medieval period. These performances showed Christ's torture in realistic detail: the scourging, the crown of thorns, the nailing to the cross. Actors playing Christ actually suffered during performances, using real whips, wearing actual thorns. The line between representation and reality collapsed, suffering for art becoming suffering as art. These plays sometimes triggered anti-Jewish violence. The crowd watching Christ's torture in the play might then attack Jewish communities, holding them collectively responsible for the historical crucifixion. The emotional intensity generated by watching dramatized torture translated into real violence, showing how performance of suffering connected to actual brutality. Music accompanied some executions. Drums rolled during beheadings, marking the moment of death. Bells tolled. Hymns were sung. This musical accompaniment gave executions liturgical quality, made them resemble religious ceremonies. The condemned person's death became a kind of sacrifice, their suffering offered up within a framework of sound and ritual. The language used to describe torture reveals cultural attitudes. Pain was sometimes described in positive terms: cleansing, purifying, righteous. The tortured person was being corrected, improved, saved. This euphemistic language obscured the reality of what was happening, made torture sound beneficial rather than harmful. Modern parallels in enhanced interrogation or other euphemisms show how language continues to mask violence. Legal Latin terms for torture were similarly euphemistic. The question referred to judicial torture, making it sound like mere inquiry rather than the infliction of agony. Putting to the question meant torturing someone, but the phrasing suggested polite conversation. This bureaucratic language let officials discuss torture without confronting its reality. Records of torture sessions used clinical, detached language. The accused was applied to the rack, water was administered, the strappado was employed. These passive constructions removed agency, made torture seem like something that happened rather than something people did. The torturer became invisible in the grammar, The victim became passive object. The violence became abstract process. This linguistic distancing served psychological functions for those involved. Torturers could think of themselves as merely doing their job, following procedures. Judges could authorize torture without imagining the actual suffering. Officials could record torture sessions without confronting the human reality. Language created distance between action and understanding, allowing torture to continue. The training of torturers involved learning not just techniques, but also this linguistic and psychological distancing. An apprentice executioner learned to see bodies as objects to be manipulated, learned the professional terminology that made violence sound technical. They learned to ignore screams, to interpret begging as weakness rather than suffering, to focus on the task rather than the person. Some torturers apparently enjoyed their work, found satisfaction in the power they wielded, took pleasure in others' pain. These individuals might have had sadistic tendencies that their profession enabled and legitimized. But most torturers were probably ordinary people doing a job, neither particularly cruel nor particularly kind, going through motions and collecting their pay. The possibility that torture could be routine work, neither heroic nor monstrous but simply employment, is perhaps most disturbing. It suggests that almost anyone could become a torturer, given the right circumstances, that there's no special moral failing required, just institutional support and social permission. This ordinariness of evil means we can't identify and exclude potential torturers. They're us, or could be, under different circumstances. Resistance to torture was rare but not absent. Some officials refused to participate, resigned their positions, spoke against the practice. Some religious figures condemned torture even when church authorities authorized it. Some philosophers and legal theorists questioned torture's legitimacy. These dissenting voices were marginalized, but they existed, showing that medieval society wasn't monolithic in accepting torture. The Waldensians, a proto-Protestant movement emerging in the 12th century, opposed violence, including torture and execution. They were persecuted as heretics, many tortured and killed for their beliefs, including their belief that torture was wrong. The irony of torturing people who opposed torture apparently wasn't obvious to the authorities prosecuting them. Some Franciscans, particularly the spiritual Franciscans who emphasize radical poverty and simplicity, question the Church's use of violence. They argue that Christ's teachings emphasized mercy and forgiveness, that torture violated Christian ethics. These voices were condemned as heretical, the spirituals persecuted, their critiques suppressed, but they represented an internal challenge to torture's legitimization. Peasant revolts occasionally targeted executioners and torturers. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, rebels killed some royal officials, including those associated with law enforcement. During the German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, some torture chambers were destroyed, some torturers killed. These acts represented popular rage against institutional violence, though the revolts were suppressed and revenge taken. The survival of some torture instruments in museums and private collections represents a later commodification of suffering. In the 18th and 19th centuries, torture devices became curiosities, displayed to shock and titillate viewers. The instruments that had caused real agony became entertainment again, their historical context stripped away, their victims forgotten, the devices themselves fetishized. Modern torture museums, with their iron maidens and racks and cages, often present fabricated or exaggerated histories. They claim devices were used more widely than evidence supports. They display Victorian-era creations as authentic medieval tools. They turn torture into tourist attraction, educational experience packaged for consumption. This commercialization of suffering raises ethical questions about how we remember and present historical violence. The actual torture implements that survive are often mundane: chains and shackles, whips, simple wooden frames. The elaborately mechanical devices that fill museums are often later inventions or extremely rare examples blown out of proportion. Real medieval torture usually employed simple tools: rope, wood, iron, fire. The banality of these implements reflects torture's banality, its status as routine violence using available means. Archaeological evidence of torture exists but is often ambiguous. Skeletal remains showing healed fractures in patterns consistent with torture. Mass graves suggesting executions, prison cells in castle basements. But these physical traces can't capture torture's full reality. the psychological dimensions, the social meanings, the individual experiences of suffering. Written records provide more detail, but require careful interpretation. Torture session transcripts might be accurate or might be shaped by scribes to serve particular purposes. Trial records might reflect what actually happened or might be propaganda. Legal codes prescribe what should happen, not necessarily what did happen. Historians must work with fragmentary, biased sources to reconstruct torture's reality. Some of the most detailed torture accounts come from martyrologies, descriptions of saints' tortures written to glorify their suffering. But these accounts were written decades or centuries after events, often embellished for dramatic effect, serving religious rather than historical purposes. They tell us how later generations wanted to remember martyrs, not necessarily what actually happened. The challenge of historical accuracy around torture matters because inaccurate accounts can trivialize real suffering. If we believe Iron Maidens were common, we might miss the actual, simpler brutality of medieval justice. If we focus on spectacular but rare methods, we overlook routine violence. Getting history right means honouring victims by acknowledging their actual suffering, rather than replacing it with sensationalised fiction. The gradual restriction and eventual abolition of torture in most of Europe happened unevenly across regions and social classes. Prussia abolished judicial torture in 1754, but torture continued in prisons unofficially. France abolished it in 1788, but military forces continued using it. England never formally abolished what was never formally legal. The legal changes often preceded cultural changes, torture remaining socially acceptable even when legally prohibited. The replacement of torture with other forms of punishment created new cruelties. Long-term imprisonment, solitary confinement, transportation to penal colonies, these modern punishments inflicted psychological suffering that some argue equals or exceeds torture's physical pain. The question of whether modern punishment is genuinely more humane or just differently cruel remains contested. Torture's persistence despite abolition shows how deeply it's embedded in structures of power. When states face threats, real or imagined, torture resurges. During wars, rebellions, revolutions, torture returns even in societies that claim to have abolished it. The legal prohibitions prove fragile when authorities decide necessity overrides ethics. The medieval period's contribution to torture history was making it systematic, documented, legally rationalised. Earlier societies tortured, but medieval Europe created elaborate frameworks justifying and regulating torture. This bureaucratization made torture more persistent because it was woven into legal and religious institutions rather than depending on individual cruelty. The Enlightenment critique of torture focused on its irrationality and unreliability rather than primarily on its cruelty. Reformers argued that torture produced false confessions, that innocent people confessed to stop pain while guilty people with high pain tolerance might resist. This utilitarian argument against torture was pragmatic rather than purely moral, making it persuasive to authorities concerned with effective justice. But focusing on torture's ineffectiveness rather than its immorality created problems. It suggested that if torture could be made reliable, if false confessions could be minimized, then torture might be acceptable. It left open the possibility that effective torture could be justified, that reliability rather than humanity should govern punishment decisions. The human rights framework that eventually rejected torture completely, based on inherent human dignity regardless of guilt or utility, emerged slowly from Enlightenment foundations. The idea that some things are wrong regardless of whether they work, that human beings have rights that can't be violated even for good purposes, represented a philosophical shift that took centuries to develop and remains contested. International law now prohibits torture under all circumstances, no exceptions allowed. The UN Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions, various human rights treaties all ban torture absolutely. Yet torture continues in many countries, including democracies that ratified these treaties. The gap between legal prohibition and actual practice reveals how difficult it is to eliminate practices as deeply rooted as torture. The medieval 1,000 years of torture establish patterns that persist. The dehumanization of victims, the bureaucratic language that obscures violence, the elaborate justifications, the ordinary people doing terrible things, the spectacle of suffering, the economic incentives, the integration with legal and religious systems. Understanding these patterns helps recognize torture when it appears in contemporary forms. As this extended exploration concludes, the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honour medieval torture's victims, people whose names we often don't know, whose suffering was recorded only in bureaucratic prose or not recorded at all? How do we learn from this history without being paralysed by its darkness? Perhaps the answer is to remember that every torture victim was a person. They had lives before torture, hopes and fears, relationships and dreams. They suffered not as abstract historical figures, but as embodied humans experiencing unbearable pain. They died not as statistics, but as individuals whose deaths mattered to someone. Perhaps we honour them by refusing to repeat history, by recognising torture's patterns when they appear, by resisting justifications that make cruelty seem necessary. Perhaps we honour them by being uncomfortable with this history, by not consuming torture as entertainment, by treating suffering with the gravity it deserves. The 1,000 years of medieval torture taught us what humans are capable of when institutions authorise violence, when cultures justify cruelty, when ordinary people accept extraordinary evil as normal. These lessons remain urgently relevant. The torture chambers may be empty now, but the forces that filled them persist. Only vigilance, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to human dignity can prevent their filling again. Thank you for staying through this long, difficult journey. Thank you for bearing witness to suffering that happened centuries ago, but deserves to be remembered. Thank you for not turning away from darkness, for confronting humanity's capacity for cruelty honestly. May this knowledge serve not to despair but to resolve, not to cynicism but to commitment, not to acceptance of violence but to determination that such things must not continue. Wherever you are, whatever time zone you occupy, as this history settles into your mind, remember that the choice not to torture, the decision to treat even enemies with basic dignity, the refusal to inflict unnecessary suffering, these aren't natural or automatic. They're choices we must make again and again, individually and collectively. The 1,000 years of medieval torture remind us how easily different choices were made and normalised. May we choose better. May we remember the suffering documented in these pages not as distant history, but as warning and witness. May the voices of torture's victims, silent now for centuries, still speak to us about the cost of cruelty and the value of mercy, and may the empty torture chambers remain empty, monuments to a past we've transcended rather than a present we've merely hidden, or a future we're preparing to repeat. By acknowledging them, can we begin to step into light,